In 1097 AD, on the scorched plains of La Mancha, beneath the shadow of a hilltop fortress, the son of the greatest warrior in Christendom fell beneath Almoravid spears, and our silver-armored good knight stood in the vanguard as 20,000 warriors clashed in the battle that shattered the myth of the unstoppable Christian charge. As Diego Rodriguez, heir to El Cid's legend, led the flower of Castilian chivalry against the disciplined wall of North African infantry, this wasn't just another border skirmish. It was the moment when the drums of the Almoravid Empire drowned out the thunder of Christian hooves, when the feudal dream of conquest broke against the hedge of spears, and when the future of the Reconquista hung by a thread inside a besieged castle with no water and no hope. Watch as our good knight survives the encirclement that killed a dynasty, scrambles up rocky slopes as the rout turns to massacre, and endures 8 days of thirst-maddened siege while the Berber host circles below like wolves around a wounded stag. From the deafening psychological warfare of massed war drums that panicked the warhorses, to the desperate final scramble to the castle of La Muela as the Castilian line collapsed into chaos, every moment of this catastrophe reshaped the balance of power in medieval Iberia and proved that courage alone could not overcome doctrine, discipline, and the merciless heat of a Spanish August. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive historical journeys that place you in the heart of history's most brutal turning points, where our eternal knight in silver armor guides you through the rise and fall of kingdoms with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which battle you'd like the good knight to survive next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that August day in 1097 when the drums began and the world changed forever. Chapter 1. The Weight of Silver. The good knight had worn his armor for so many years that he no longer remembered the feeling of its weight. The silver plates had become a second skin, moving with him as naturally as muscle and bone. But on this morning, the 15th day of August in the year of our Lord 1097, the metal felt different, heavier, as if the armor itself knew what was coming. He stood in the second line of the Castilian host, his destrier shifting beneath him, nostrils flaring at the scent of something the knight could not yet name. Fear, perhaps, or destiny. The plains of La Mancha stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of parched yellow grass beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The heat was already oppressive, though the sun had barely cleared the eastern horizon. August in this land was a crucible, a test of endurance even before the first sword was drawn. Behind him, rising like a broken tooth from the flat earth, stood the Cerro Calderico, the ridge that dominated the landscape for miles around. Atop that rocky prominence sat the castle of La Muela, its walls catching the early light. The fortress was their anchor, their refuge if things went poorly. The good knight had seen it as they'd marched into position in the pre-dawn darkness, a silhouette against the stars. He had not thought then that he would need it. Now, as the sun climbed and the enemy began to take shape across the plain, he was not so certain. The Almoravid army was assembling with a precision that unnerved him. These were not the fractious, disorganized levies of the Taifa kingdoms, the petty Muslim city-states that had paid tribute to King Alfonso for years, buying peace with gold rather than risking battle. No, these warriors from across the sea were something else entirely. They moved in blocks, in formations, their ranks dressed as neatly as if they were on parade rather than preparing for slaughter. The good knight could see their shields. Great oval, things made of layered hide, painted white and black. He could see the forest of spear points, all angled at precisely the same degree. And he could see the veils. The Al-Mulath Thamun, they were called. The veiled ones. Berber tribesmen from the deep Sahara who wrapped their faces in indigo cloth, leaving only their eyes visible. It was said that these men never removed their veils, not even to eat or drink. It was said they were fanatics, men who had crossed the sea not for gold or land, but for jihad, holy war. The good knight did not know if the stories were true, but looking at those silent, disciplined ranks, he believed them. Around him, the Castilian knights were restless. They sat their horses with the easy confidence of men who had never truly been beaten, not in any way that mattered. They were the heavy cavalry of Castile-Leon, the hammer of Christendom, the iron fist of King Alfonso VI. They had taken Toledo 12 years ago, driving a dagger into the heart of Al-Andalus. They had raided as far south as Seville and Córdoba, burning and plundering with impunity. They were, in their own minds, invincible. The good knight had lived long enough to know that no one was invincible. He glanced to his left, where the vanguard was forming. That was where the glory would be won or lost today. The vanguard was composed of the finest knights, the youngest and most eager, the ones who would strike first and hardest. Leading them was a young man whose name carried more weight than his years might suggest. Diego Rodriguez, the only son of Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar. El Cid, the campeador, the champion, the man who had carved out his own kingdom in Valencia, who had defeated Muslim and Christian alike, who had become a legend while still breathing. His son had come north from Valencia with a contingent of knights, answering the call of King Alfonso, the same king who had once exiled Diego's father, the same king who now needed every sword he could muster. The good knight studied the young man from a distance. Diego Rodriguez sat tall in his saddle, his banner snapping in the hot wind. He was perhaps 20 years old, maybe less. His armor was fine, his horse was strong, and his bearing was proud. He looked like his father, or so the good knight had heard. He had never met El Cid himself, but the stories were everywhere. The son was trying to live up to a legend, and that was a heavy burden for any man to carry. Heavier, even, than silver armor. A horn sounded, a long, mournful note that cut through the morning heat. The good knight's destrier tossed its head, ears flicking forward. The signal to prepare. All along the Castilian line, knights checked their weapons, tightened their grips on lances, muttered prayers to Santiago and the Virgin. The good knight did none of these things. He simply sat, watching, waiting. He had learned over the long years that battles were not won in the first moments. They were won, or lost, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the decisions made when exhaustion and terror stripped away all pretense. He had learned that survival was not about courage. It was about awareness, about seeing the shape of the fight before it fully formed. And what he saw now, across the shimmering plain, troubled him deeply. The Almoravid line was not moving. They were not charging, not maneuvering, not even shouting. They simply stood, silent and still, their spears grounded, their shields locked. It was unnatural. Armies were supposed to roar, to beat their weapons against their shields, to work themselves into a frenzy before the clash. But these men were quiet, waiting. And then the drums began. Chapter 2. The Wall of Sound. At first, it was a single beat, a deep, resonant thud that seemed to come from the earth itself. The good knight felt it in his chest before he heard it, a vibration that traveled through the ground and up through his horse's legs into his own body. Then a second drum joined, and a third, and a fourth. Within moments, the entire Almoravid line was pounding out a rhythm, hundreds of drums, perhaps thousands, all beating in perfect unison. The sound was not loud in the way a shout is loud. It was something else. It was a presence, a physical force that pressed against the ears and the skull and the heart. It was relentless, unchanging, a heartbeat that belonged to something vast and inhuman. The good knight's destrier began to dance sideways, eyes rolling white. All along the Castilian line, horses were reacting the same way, tossing their heads, backing up, whinnying in distress. The knights fought to control their mounts, yanking on reins, digging in, spurs cursing. But the drums did not stop. They did not waver. They simply continued, beat after beat after beat, drowning out every other sound. The good knight leaned forward, speaking softly into his horse's ear, a steady stream of meaningless words meant only to soothe. The destrier's muscles were trembling beneath him, every instinct screaming to flee. Horses were prey animals, for all their size and strength. They knew, on some deep level, when they were being hunted. And the drums were telling them, in a language older than words, that death was coming. He could see the vanguard beginning to waver. Diego Rodriguez was shouting something, his voice lost in the thunder of the drums. The young man's horse was rearing, front hooves pawing the air. Other knights were having similar troubles. The neat formation was beginning to fray at the edges, gaps opening as horses refused to hold their positions. This was the genius of it, the good knight realized. The Almoravids were not attacking. They were simply standing there, letting the drums do the work. They were breaking the Castilian charge before it even began, sowing chaos and fear without losing a single man. A second horn sounded, 3 sharp blasts. The signal to charge. The good knight's stomach tightened. It was too soon. The horses were not ready. The men were not ready. But King Alfonso was not a patient man, and he had not marched all the way from the siege of Zaragoza to sit and listen to drums. He wanted battle. He wanted victory. He wanted to prove, once again, that Christian steel was superior to Muslim discipline. The vanguard lurched forward. It was not the thunderous unified charge that the Castilian doctrine demanded. It was ragged, uneven, some knights spurring ahead, while others struggled to control their mounts. Diego Rodriguez was in the lead, his lance leveled, his banner streaming behind him. The young man was brave. The good knight had to give him that. Brave or foolish, sometimes. It was hard to tell the difference. The drums grew louder. The good knight's own line began to move, the second wave following the vanguard as doctrine required. He let his destrier have its head, trusting the animal's training to carry him forward. Around him, knights were shouting now, war cries meant to bolster their own courage as much as to frighten the enemy. But their voices were thin, swallowed by the relentless percussion. The distance between the two armies closed with terrible speed. The good knight could see individual faces now, or at least the eyes above the indigo veils. Dark eyes, calm eyes, eyes that did not flinch as 2,000 pounds of horse and armored man bore down on them. And then, 50 yards from contact, the Almoravid infantry did something that changed everything. They knelt. As one, in perfect unison, the entire front rank dropped to one knee. Their shields came up, overlapping, forming a continuous wall, and their spears, long, wicked things, twice the length of a Castilian lance, angled forward and down, butts braced against the ground, points aimed at the chests of the oncoming horses. It was a hedge. A wall of iron thorns. The good knight had seen this tactic before, in other battles, other wars. He knew what was about to happen. He tried to pull his destrier to the side, to angle away from the spear points, but there was no room. The press of bodies behind him, the momentum of the charge, the sheer mass of the Castilian host, all of it drove him forward, toward the waiting blades. The vanguard hit the Almoravid line like a wave breaking against a cliff. Horses screamed. Men screamed. The sound of impact was a cacophony of splintering lances, tearing flesh, crunching bone. The good knight saw Adestria impale itself on 3 spears at once, the animal's momentum driving the points deep into its chest. The knight atop it was thrown forward, crashing into the shield wall, where a dozen hands dragged him down into the press of bodies. Another horse tried to leap the hedge, but its legs tangled in the spear shafts and it came down hard, crushing its rider beneath its weight. Everywhere the good knight looked, the charge was faltering, stalling, the kinetic energy that was supposed to shatter the enemy line bleeding away into chaos and confusion. Diego Rodriguez was still mounted somehow. The young man had managed to force his horse through a gap in the line, and now he was surrounded, his sword rising and falling as he tried to cut his way clear. The good knight could see the desperation in his movements, the wild swings of a man who knew he was trapped. And then the arrows began to fall. Chapter 3. The Kill Zone. The Almoravid archers had been waiting for this moment. They stood in ranks behind the infantry, their bows drawn, and now they loosed. The sky darkened with shafts. Not a single volley, but a continuous rain, wave after wave of arrows arcing high and then plunging down into the stalled mass of Castilian cavalry. The good knight raised his shield instinctively, feeling the impacts shudder through his arm as arrows struck the wood and iron. One shaft glanced off his shoulder plate with a screech of metal on metal. Another buried itself in his saddle, missing his thigh by inches. His destrier staggered as an arrow punched through the mail barding on its neck, and the good knight felt the animal's strength begin to fade. All around him, knights were going down. A man to his right took an arrow through the eye slit of his helmet and toppled backward, dead before he hit the ground. Another was struck in the throat, the shaft punching through the mail coif, and he clutched at the wound with both hands, blood pouring between his fingers. The vanguard was being slaughtered. The good knight could see it happening, could see the Almoravid infantry rising from their kneeling positions now that the charge had been stopped, their spears stabbing upward into the bellies of horses, into the gaps in armor where leg met torso. The Castilian knights were fighting back, but they were fighting as individuals, each man isolated in his own private hell, unable to coordinate, unable to retreat. Diego Rodriguez was still visible, still fighting. His horse was down now, and the young man was on foot, his shield shattered, his sword slick with blood. He was surrounded by a knot of Almoravid infantry, and they were closing in like wolves on a wounded deer. The good knight wanted to help. Every instinct, every shred of honor demanded that he spur forward, that he try to reach the son of El Cid, that he die trying if necessary. But his horse was dying beneath him, its breath coming in wet, labored gasps, and he knew that if he did not dismount now, he would be trapped beneath the animal's corpse when it fell. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground, his boots hitting the hard, packed earth with a jolt that rattled his teeth. The destrier collapsed a moment later, its legs folding, its great head striking the ground with a sound like a hammer on an anvil. The good knight spared it one last glance. The animal had served him well, and then he turned his attention to survival. The battlefield was a nightmare of noise and motion. Men were screaming, horses were screaming, the drums were still pounding, and beneath it all was the wet, meaty sound of blades cutting flesh. The good knight moved through the chaos, his sword in his hand, his shield up, his eyes scanning for threats. An Almoravid infantryman lunged at him, spear thrusting for his belly. The good knight sidestepped, letting the point slide past, and brought his sword down on the shaft, snapping it. The man stumbled, off balance, and the good knight's return stroke took him in the side of the neck, above the edge of his shield. Blood sprayed, hot and coppery, and the man went down. Another came from the left, and the good knight caught the spear thrust on his shield, the impact jarring his arm. He shoved forward, using his weight and the strength of his armor to drive the man back, And then he stabbed low, under the rim of the shield, feeling his blade punch through leather and flesh. The man gasped, a wet, choking sound, and fell. The good knight did not stop moving. To stop was to die. He could see in the brief moments when the press of bodies opened up that the Castilian line was collapsing. The vanguard was gone, destroyed. The main body was wavering, knights turning their horses, trying to disengage, trying to flee. And on the flanks, the Almoravid light cavalry was moving. They came in fast, a swarm of riders on small, agile horses, their lances short and their movements fluid. They did not charge headlong like the Castilian knights. They darted in, struck, and wheeled away, harrying the edges of the Christian formation, cutting down anyone who strayed too far from the main body. It was an envelopment, a classic double envelopment, the kind that had destroyed armies since the days of Hannibal. The Almoravids were closing the jaws of a trap, and the Castilians were caught inside. The good knight saw Diego Rodriguez fall. It happened quickly, almost too quickly to register. One moment the young man was standing, his sword raised, defiant to the last. The next, a spear took him in the side, punching through the mail, and he went down to one knee. A second, spear struck him in the back, and he pitched forward onto his face. His banner fell with him, the bright colors disappearing into the dust and blood. The good knight felt something twist in his chest. He had not known the boy, had never spoken to him, but he had known what Diego Rodriguez represented, the future, the hope, the continuation of a legacy. And now that future was gone, trampled into the dirt of La Mancha. A horn sounded, a Castilian horn this time. 3 long, desperate blasts, the signal to retreat. The good knight did not need to be told twice. Chapter 4. The Route. A retreat is an organized withdrawal, a controlled movement away from the enemy while maintaining formation and discipline. A route is something else entirely. It is the breakdown of order, the dissolution of an army into a mob of terrified individuals, each concerned only with his own survival. What happened on the plains of Consuegra that August morning was a rout. The good knight ran. He was not ashamed of it. Shame was a luxury for men who had never seen a battle turn, who had never felt the cold certainty that death was seconds away. He ran because to stay was to die, and he had not survived this long by choosing death over life. All around him, other men were running too. Knights who had abandoned their horses, men-at-arms who had thrown down their weapons to move faster, even a few of the Castilian infantry who had been guarding the camp and now found themselves swept up in the tide of fleeing bodies. The Almoravid cavalry was among them, cutting down the Itzerts, slowest, the weakest, the unluckiest. The good knight's armor, which had felt so heavy that morning, now felt like a death sentence. Each step was an effort, the weight of the silver plates dragging at him, the heat inside the metal shell rising to unbearable levels. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, soaking the padding beneath the mail. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation burning his lungs. But he did not stop. He could see the Cerro Calderico ahead, the ridge rising from the plain like a promise of salvation. The castle of La Muela sat atop it, its walls solid and real. If he could reach it, if he could get inside, he would live. It was that simple. Behind him a man screamed. The good knight did not look back. He had learned long ago that looking back only slowed you down, and in a rout, every second mattered. The ground began to slope upward. He was at the base of the ridge now, the rocky terrain replacing the flat plain. The Almoravid cavalry was pulling back. Their horses could not navigate the steep, broken ground as easily as a man on foot could. But the infantry was still coming, and they were faster than the armored knights. The good knight began to climb. The slope was brutal. Loose stones shifted under his boots, threatening to send him tumbling back down. Thorny scrub tore at his hands as he grabbed for handholds. His legs burned, his lungs burned, his entire body screamed for him to stop, to rest, to give up. He did not give up. Other men were climbing around him, a desperate scramble of bodies clawing their way toward the castle. Some made it, others did not. The good knight heard a man lose his footing and slide back down the slope, his scream cutting off abruptly as an Almoravid spear found him. The good knight climbed faster. His vision was narrowing, the edges going dark. Heat exhaustion, he knew. The armor was cooking him alive. But the gates of the castle were above him now, so close, and he could see men on the walls. Castilian soldiers, waving and shouting, urging the survivors to hurry. He reached the top of the ridge and staggered the last few yards to the gate. Hands grabbed him, pulled him inside, and he collapsed onto the stone courtyard, his chest heaving, his body shaking. He had made it. But as he lay there, gasping for air, he could hear the sounds from below. The screams of men who had not been fast enough. The triumphant shouts of the Almoravids, the drums still pounding, relentless and eternal. And he knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones like cold iron, that this was not over. Chapter 5. The Castle of Thirst. The castle of La Muela had never been designed to hold this many men. The good knight sat with his back against the inner wall of the courtyard, his helmet off, his head tilted back to catch what little breeze moved through the stifling air. Around him, the survivors of the battle were packed into every available space. Knights, men-at-arms, a handful of infantry, even a few camp followers who had fled with the army. The courtyard was a sea of exhausted, bloodied bodies, and the air reeked of sweat, blood, and fear. King Alfonso was here, somewhere. The good knight had seen him briefly, the king's face pale and drawn, a bandage wrapped around his left arm. The rumors said he had been wounded in the fighting, though not seriously. The rumors also said that he had barely made it to the castle himself, that his horse had been killed under him, that he had climbed the ridge on foot like any common soldier. The good knight did not know if the rumors were true. He did not particularly care. Kings and common soldiers bled the same when cut, and they thirsted the same when trapped. And they were trapped. From his position against the wall, the good knight could see over the battlements to the plain below. The Almoravid army had not left. They had encamped around the base of the ridge, their tents spreading out like a white and black patchwork quilt. Cooking fires were already burning, and the good knight could smell roasting meat on the wind. His stomach clenched painfully. He had not eaten since the night before, and the battle had burned through what little energy he had left. But hunger was not the problem. Not yet. Water was the problem. The castle had a cistern, a deep stone reservoir built into the bedrock of the ridge. In normal times, it held enough water to sustain a garrison of perhaps 50 men for a month. Maybe longer. But there were not 50 men inside the castle now. There were hundreds. And it was August, the hottest, driest month of the year. The good knight had already done the math in his head. Even with strict rationing, the water would last perhaps a week. Maybe less, if the heat continued. And the Almoravids knew it. They did not need to storm the walls. They could simply wait, let the sun and thirst do their work, and then walk in and take whatever they wanted from the corpses. A man approached, one of the king's household knights, his surcoat stained with dust and blood. "You," he said, pointing at the good knight. "The king wants account of the survivors. How many men in your company made it?" The good knight looked up at him, his expression flat. "I have no company. I fight alone." The knight frowned. "Then what are you doing here?" "Surviving." The knight opened his mouth to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. He moved on, barking questions at other men, trying to impose some semblance of order on the chaos. The good knight closed his eyes. He was so tired. Not just physically, though his body ached in 1,000 places, but tired in a deeper way. Tired of war, tired of watching men die, tired of the endless cycle of charge and retreat, victory and defeat, glory and ruin. He thought of Diego Rodriguez lying somewhere on the plain below, his body already being picked over by scavengers. The boy had been brave and young and doomed. The son of a legend, sent to die in a battle that should never have been fought. The good knight wondered if El Cid knew yet, wondered how the news would reach him and what the campeador would do when he learned that his only son was dead. Probably nothing, the good knight thought bitterly. What could he do? Valencia was hundreds of miles away, and El Cid was not a young man anymore. By the time word reached him, the battle would be long over, the dead long buried, if they were buried at all. The sun climbed higher, and the heat inside the castle became oppressive. Men began to shed their armor, piling it in corners, desperate for relief. The good knight kept his on. He had learned that lesson too many times. The moment you let your guard down was the moment the enemy struck. By midday, the first man asked for water. The request was denied. By evening, men were begging. Chapter 6. The Siege. The first day of the siege was the hardest, because hope had not yet died. Men still believed that relief was coming, that El Cid would march north from Valencia with his army, that the garrison of Toledo would sally forth, that God himself would intervene, because surely the Almighty would not allow his faithful to perish of thirst while the infidels feasted below. The good knight knew better. He had been in sieges before. He knew that hope was a slow poison, a thing that kept you alive just long enough to make the dying worse. On the second day, the rationing began in earnest. Each man was allowed a single cup of water at dawn and another at dusk. It was not enough. Not nearly enough, not in this heat. Men's lips cracked and bled. Their tongues swelled. Some began to hallucinate, seeing rivers and fountains that did not exist. The good knight drank his ration slowly, letting each sip sit in his mouth before swallowing, trying to make it last. He had done this before, too. He knew the tricks. Breathe through your nose to conserve moisture. Stay in the shade. Do not talk unless absolutely necessary. Do not move unless you must. Survive. On the third day, a group of knights approached King Alfonso and demanded that they attempt a breakout. Better to die fighting, they argued, than to die of thirst like animals. The king refused. The Almoravids outnumbered them 10-1, and the men were already weakened. A breakout would be a massacre. The knights grumbled but obeyed. For now. On the fourth day, the first man died, not from thirst, not yet, but from an infected wound he had taken in the battle. The good knight watched as they carried the body to the far corner of the courtyard and laid it with the others. There were 5 corpses now, wrapped in cloaks, waiting for burial that might never come. On the 5th day, the Almoravids began to taunt them. They rode up to the base of the ridge, just out of bowshot, and poured water onto the ground. Gallons of it, precious and clear, soaking into the dry earth while the men on the walls watched in silent agony. Some of the younger knights shouted curses, but their voices were hoarse, cracked, powerless. The good knight did not watch. He sat in the shade of the wall, conserving his strength, and tried not to think about water. On the 6th day, men began to drink their own urine. The good knight did not judge them. Desperation stripped away dignity, and dignity was a luxury in a siege. He had not yet reached that point himself, but he knew it was coming. The cistern was nearly empty. The cupfuls had become half-cupfuls, and soon they would become nothing at all. On the 7th day, the Almoravids stopped taunting them. The good knight noticed the change immediately. The enemy camp below was quieter, less active. Scouts were riding out, heading north and east, and there was a sense of urgency. Something had changed. By evening, the reason became clear. A messenger had made it into the castle, a lone rider who had somehow slipped through the Almoravid lines under cover of darkness. He brought news. Yusuf ibn Tashfin was withdrawing. The Almoravid army was breaking camp, preparing to march south. The men in the castle did not cheer. They did not have the strength. But the good knight could see the relief in their eyes, the loosening of the terrible tension that had gripped them all. They were going to live. On the 8th day, the Almoravids were gone. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. The gates of the castle of La Muela opened at dawn, and the survivors stumbled out into the light. The good knight moved slowly, his legs unsteady, his body weak from days of thirst and hunger. Around him, other men were doing the same, blinking in the harsh sunlight, looking around as if they could not quite believe they were free. The Almoravid camp was abandoned. The tents were gone, the fires cold, the ground trampled and littered with refuse. But the enemy was truly gone. The plain was empty. The good knight made his way down the ridge, his boots slipping on the loose stones. He was not sure why he was descending. There was nothing down there for him. But something pulled him forward, some need to see the place where it had all gone wrong. The battlefield was a charnel house. Bodies lay everywhere, bloated and black in the heat, covered in flies. Castilian knights in their mail and surcoats, Almoravid infantry in their white robes, horses with their legs stiff and their bellies swollen. The scavengers had been at work, crows and vultures and wild dogs, and the dead had been picked over, their valuables taken, their flesh torn. The good knight walked among them, his face expressionless. He had seen this before, too, the aftermath, the silence that followed the screaming. He found Diego Rodriguez by his banner. The young man's body was lying face down, his armor stripped, his back a mass of dried blood. Someone, Almoravid or scavenger, it did not matter, had taken his sword, his helmet, even his boots. All that remained was the corpse and the banner, the bright colors faded and stained. The good knight stood over the body for a long moment. He thought about saying a prayer, but the words would not come. What prayer could encompass this? What words could make sense of a boy dying for a king who had exiled his father in a battle that had achieved nothing? In the end, the good knight said nothing. He simply turned and walked away. They moved slowly, a ragged column of broken men and exhausted horses, their eyes hollow, their spirits crushed. The good knight travelled with them, though he was not truly one of them. He never was. He was a ghost, a shadow, a man who walked through history, but was never quite part of it. King Alfonso rode at the head of the column, his face set in a mask of grim determination. The king had survived, and that was something. But the cost had been terrible. The vanguard was destroyed. Diego Rodriguez was dead. The myth of Castilian invincibility had been shattered on the plains of La Mancha, and the Almoravids were still out there, somewhere to the south, their army intact, their confidence unshaken. The good knight thought about the drums. He could still hear them, sometimes, in the quiet moments. That relentless, pounding rhythm, the heartbeat of an empire that had crossed the sea to reclaim what it saw as its own. He thought about the hedge of spears, the wall of shields, the Disciplined ranks that had stood firm while the Castilian charge broke against them like a wave against stone. He thought about the heat, the thirst, the 8 days trapped inside the castle, waiting to die. And he thought about Diego Rodriguez, lying in the dust, his future stolen, his father's legacy ended. The good knight had survived. He always survived. But survival was not victory, and it was not peace. It was simply the continuation of the long, slow march through time, from one battle to the next, from one tragedy to another. When the column reached Toledo, the people came out to meet them. But there were no cheers, no celebrations. The citizens could see the truth in the faces of the returning soldiers. They had gone out as conquerors and come back as survivors. The good knight did not enter the city. He had no business there, no ties to bind him. Instead, he turned his horse, a new mount, taken from the castle's stables, and rode west toward the setting sun. He did not know where he was going. He never did. But the road was long, and there would be other battles, other wars, other moments when the world hung in the balance, and men fought and died for causes they barely understood. And the good knight would be there in his silver armor, watching, surviving, bearing witness, because that was what he did. That was all he had ever done. Epilogue. The weight of memory. Years later, when the good knight was far from Iberia, fighting in wars that had nothing to do with Castile or Almoravids, he would sometimes dream of Consuegra. He would dream of the drums, that terrible, endless rhythm that had broken the courage of horses and men alike. He would dream of the hedge of spears, the wall of shields, the silent, veiled warriors who had stood their ground while the world charged at them. He would dream of the climb up the ridge, his lungs burning, his legs screaming, the cries of the dying echoing behind him, and he would dream of Diego Rodriguez, the boy who had carried the weight of a legend and been crushed beneath it. The good knight did not know what had become of El Cid after his son's death. He had heard rumors, years later, that the campeador had died in Valencia, that his widow had held the city for a time before abandoning it to the Almoravids. He had heard that El Cid's body had been strapped to his horse and paraded through the streets one last time, a final act of defiance against the enemies who had taken everything from him. The good knight did not know if the stories were true. But he knew this. The Battle of Consuegra had changed something. It had proven that the Christian kingdoms were not invincible, that the Almoravids were not just raiders but conquerors, that the Reconquista was not a foregone conclusion but a long, brutal struggle that would consume generations. And he knew that he had been there on that August day in 1097 when the drums began and the world changed. He had stood in the second line, watching the vanguard charge to its doom. He had fought in the chaos, killed men whose faces he could no longer remember, and fled when the line collapsed. He had climbed the ridge, survived the siege, and walked away from the battlefield with nothing but his life and his memories. And those memories, he knew, would never leave him. They were the weight he carried, heavier than any armor, sharper than any blade. They were the price of survival. The good knight rode on, through the years and the wars, through the rise and fall of kingdoms, through the endless cycle of violence and peace and violence again. He rode in his silver armor, always alone, always watching, always remembering. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, the drums were still beating. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more.